The stars above Zalcor Prime burned cold and distant, indifferent to the slaughter that had taken place beneath them. The diplomatic residence, once a symbol of uneasy peace between humanity and the Zalcor Empire, now stood as a ruined tomb. Shattered glass crunched under the boots of the first responders, the acrid scent of charred flesh lingering in the air. The attack had been brutal, no warning, no survivors. Ambassador Julian Carter had been a patient man, a believer in diplomacy even in the face of the Zalcor's disdain. He had known their kind, had studied their rigid caste system, had sought to bridge the divide between human pragmatism and their cold, hierarchical order. His wife, Mara, had been just as devoted, working tirelessly to humanize their alien counterparts. Their daughter, Layla, had only been 10. Too young to understand why some beings saw her as a threat. Too young to die like this. A broadcast followed within hours. The Zalcor High Council expressed regret but denied responsibility, claiming that the attack was the work of rogue extremists. A convenient lie. The truth was scrawled in the wreckage: controlled demolition, precision strikes, patterns that spoke of elite military involvement, not reckless insurgents. Humanity had been sent a message, one carved in blood. The footage reached Terra within the day, circulating through classified channels before it could be buried under diplomatic pretense. Among those who watched it was Director Elias Stroud of the Revenants, the covert arm of Earth's security apparatus. He didn't waste time with outrage. He had long since discarded sentimentality in favor of calculated action. The Zalcor had overstepped, assuming humanity would respond with hollow protests and economic sanctions. They were wrong. The orders came swiftly. There would be no drawn-out deliberations in sterile government chambers. The response would be delivered in whispers, in darkness, in the final breath of a dying king. The Zalcor royal family had sanctioned the killing of a human household. Now humanity would erase theirs. For a mission of this scale, Stroud required the best. He found them in Kai and Celine Voss. They were legends whispered among those who dealt in quiet deaths. A husband and wife duo, efficient beyond measure, feared even within their own circles. They had no loyalty to flags or governments, only to each other. Stroud had worked with them before, had seen firsthand the elegance of their craft. They didn't ask questions, didn't let morality cloud their purpose. They got results. The summons came in the form of a private transmission, a coded message that required no explanation. The Vosses had long since abandoned the illusion of normalcy, existing in the shadowed corners of the galaxy, where war was not waged with fleets but with whispered names and sudden disappearances. They arrived on Stroud Station a day later. Kai was silent as always, his presence one of quiet menace, every movement deliberate, every glance carrying weight. Celine, by contrast, wore her lethality like a dancer wore grace, effortless, fluid. There was no need for pretense between them and Stroud. The Zalcor crossed a line, Stroud said, sliding a data slate across the table. Their royal family signed the order that killed our people. You're going to return the favor. Celine scanned the files, her lips pressing into a thin line. A palace of cold, imposing architecture. Security schematics. A list of names each marked for death. Kai spoke first. Timeline? A week to infiltrate. Then you execute. No hesitation. No wasted breath. Stroud leaned forward. There's no room for mistakes. The Zalcor will be expecting retaliation, even if they don't believe we have the reach to strike them where they sleep. Celine exhaled, a quiet, controlled thing. They won't see us coming. Stroud nodded. He hadn't expected anything less. As the Vosses left the briefing room, the weight of their task settled over them, though neither acknowledged it aloud. They had undertaken impossible missions before. They had seen empires crumble, had been the invisible hand pulling at the strings of history. But this was different. This was personal. Their ship cut through the void, bound for the heart of the enemy's kingdom. Behind them, the stars remained as indifferent as ever. Ahead, there was only the certainty of death. The descent onto Zalcor Prime was uneventful, though Kai and Celine knew better than to mistake quiet for safety. Their ship, an unassuming freighter registered under a dozen false identities, landed in one of the lesser ports, away from the scrutiny of high-tier security. Zalcor Prime was a world of rigid order, its cities sculpted from dark stone and cold metal, its people moving in the precise patterns of a species that had long embraced hierarchy as law. Here, everything had a place and anything that did not belong was quickly eradicated. They stepped onto the planet's surface as merchants, their disguises tailored to perfection. Celine's rich indigo cloak and intricate jewelry marked her as an exotic trader from the far fringes, while Kai, clad in the subdued garb of a bodyguard, played the role of silent enforcer. Their credentials, forged with meticulous detail, allowed them passage into the city's trade sector, where information moved as freely as goods. Celine spoke first, her voice carrying the lilt of a seasoned dealer of rare commodities. "We need a way in." Kai gave a slight nod, his gaze scanning the crowd for potential assets. The Zalcor were a species of discipline, but like all empires, their lower castes harbored dissent. It was among them that weaknesses could be found. They made contact with a man named Varen, a former palace engineer turned disgraced fugitive. His bitterness was well earned, stripped of his station for daring to question the ruling elite, now living in the shadows of the world he once helped build. He eyed them with suspicion, but greed and vengeance were powerful motivators. "The palace," Celine said, sliding a small stack of credits across the table. "Tell us what you know." Varen hesitated, fingers twitching over the currency before he pocketed it with a practiced motion. "The royal citadel is a fortress. Reinforced walls, biometric locks, elite guards bred for nothing but loyalty." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "But everything has its flaws. The maintenance tunnels beneath the structure, older than the palace itself. Forgotten by most but not by me." Kai studied the schematics Varen produced, noting the weak points, the places where shadows stretched long enough to conceal movement. "It would not be easy. It would require precision, patience." "We'll need access codes," Celine said. Varen smirked. "That'll cost extra." Kai leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Then consider it your life's final investment." Varen swallowed hard, recognizing the promise in those words. He handed over a small device. "These codes will get you into the lower levels. After that, you're on your own." They left without another word. That night, news spread through the city like wildfire. Prince Valric, second heir to the throne, was indulging himself at one of the high-end pleasure houses. A rare moment of vulnerability. An opportunity. Celine slipped inside first, moving with the practiced ease of someone who belonged. She wore a gown of liquid silver, her posture relaxed, her presence calculated to draw attention while remaining unobtrusive. She scanned the room, taking in the opulence, the careless laughter of those who had never known consequence. At the center of it all sat Valric, draped in arrogance, surrounded by sycophants who laughed a little too loudly at his words. Kai entered from the opposite side, unnoticed, a shadow in a place where people only saw spectacle. His path was direct, his focus unshaken. Celine moved closer to the prince's table, catching his eye just long enough to hold it. Valric, predictably, responded with interest. He leaned forward, dismissing the others with a wave of his hand. "You are not Zalcor," he mused, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of royalty. Celine smiled, letting the silence stretch before answering. "I deal in rare things. Perhaps you're interested." Valric chuckled, raising a glass to his lips. "I have everything I desire." She leaned in slightly, the curve of her smile sharpening. "Not everything." That was when Kai struck. A single movement, swift and absolute. The blade slid into Valric's side, severing vital arteries, stealing breath before sound could form. The prince's eyes widened in shock, the realization of death dawning too late. Celine caught his hand as he slumped forward, whispering, "Your family sends their regards." Then they vanished into the chaos. By the time the first screams pierced the air, they were already gone. The city burned behind them as they slipped into the depths of Zalcor Prime. The assassination of Prince Valric had sent the royal security forces into a frenzy, patrols sweeping through the streets, searching for ghosts that had already disappeared. Celine and Kai moved like phantoms through the Undercity, navigating the maze of tunnels with the precision of those who had planned for every contingency. Above them, sirens howled, the Empire reeling from a wound it had never expected. Deep beneath the surface, they regrouped in a hidden alcove, the walls damp with condensation, the air thick with the scent of machinery long forgotten. Kai secured the entrance, scanning for any signs of pursuit. Celine peeled off her blood-smeared gloves, her breath steady despite the adrenaline that still thrummed through her veins. "He died too easily," she murmured. Kai gave a slight nod, checking the ammunition in his sidearm. He wasn't the real fight. They both knew the prince had been a target of opportunity, a message rather than a true blow. The heart of the Zalcor's power still beat within the royal citadel, where King Zorthal and the rest of his wretched bloodline presided over their dominion. That was where the real work would begin. Varen's stolen codes had bought them away inside, but the citadel was more than just a fortress. It was a living monument to the Zalcor's reign, layered in defense systems and bound by traditions as unyielding as its walls. The only way to kill a king was to reach him before he knew he was being hunted. They moved at first light, emerging into the city's lower districts, where the undercastes labored in silent misery. The Zalcor ruled through fear, their subjects conditioned to obey without question. But fear bred resentment, and resentment could be used. Selene spotted the opportunity first. A gathering of workers near the transport hubs, their voices hushed but edged with quiet defiance. A man, older, his posture stiff with bitterness, spoke in clipped tones, his words careful yet heavy with meaning. They didn't need to hear the full conversation to understand. Kai approached without hesitation. The group stiffened at his presence, their eyes wary, but Selene stepped beside him, her voice smooth, practiced. "You despise them," she said simply. "That makes you useful." The older man, Darren, as he later introduced himself, studied them with the look of a man who had long since given up hope but still dreamed of vengeance. "And what exactly do you think you're doing?" "We're finishing what should have been started long ago," Kai replied. The silence stretched. Then Darren exhaled, shaking his head. "Fools." But there was something in his expression, something that cracked just slightly. "The Citadel is untouchable. You'll never get inside." Selene smiled. "We already have." Darren's disbelief turned to consideration. Slowly he nodded. "Then you'll need a distraction." That night, the lower district rose in protest. It was not a rebellion, it would never be so grand. But it was enough. Fires ignited, small skirmishes flared, workers refused their shifts. It was chaos, insignificant in the grand scheme of the Empire, but loud enough to pull eyes away from the shadows where Selene and Kai moved. They entered the Citadel through the tunnels Varen had promised, their passage silent, their weapons ready. The air was heavy with the scent of stone and power, the corridors vast, designed to make intruders feel small. They did not hesitate. Every step was calculated, every turn memorized. A guard crossed their path. He never saw the blade that slid between his ribs. Selene caught his body before it hit the ground, lowering it without a sound. Kai wiped the knife clean, already moving forward. There was no room for error now. The throne room was close. The king was waiting. Selene exhaled, steadying her hands. The real fight was about to begin. The throne room was a monument to power. Towering obsidian pillars loomed above, their surfaces carved with the ancient victories of the Zalcor. A deep crimson light bathed the chamber, emanating from the ceremonial braziers that lined the walls, casting jagged shadows that twisted and stretched across the polished floor. At the far end of the vast hall, upon a raised dais, sat King Zorthel, his armored form motionless, the weight of his crown pressing down upon his brow. His court flanked him, silent and waiting. They had been expecting this. Selene and Kai stepped forward, their presence an unspoken challenge. The air between them and the throne was thick with tension, with the inevitability of violence. The guards lining the chamber gripped their weapons, muscles tensed, waiting for the signal to strike. But the king did not speak immediately. He studied the assassins with the measured gaze of a ruler who had known war and seen death claim countless adversaries. "You are not the first to stand where you do," Zorthel said, his voice a deep, guttural growl. "You will not be the last." Kai's expression remained unreadable. "No," he agreed. "But we will be the last you ever see." The king exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he gave the order. The room erupted into chaos. Selene moved first, her knives flashing as she dove toward the nearest guard, slicing through armor and flesh with surgical precision. Kai followed in her wake, his sidearms spitting silent death as he advanced. The royal enforcers were trained, disciplined, but the assassins were something else entirely: lethal, methodical, relentless. They wove through the battlefield like specters, their movements fluid, their strikes precise. A warrior lunged at Kai, a massive blade sweeping toward his torso. He sidestepped at the last moment, catching the attacker's wrist and driving a knife into his throat. Selene vaulted over a fallen guard, her boot connecting with another's skull before she buried her dagger between his ribs. And still, Zorthal remained seated, watching. The last of the royal enforcers fell, his body crumpling to the floor. Blood pooled across the pristine tiles, the brazier's light reflecting off the slick surface. The throne room was silent once more. Kai and Selene stood before the dais, their breathing steady despite the carnage surrounding them. The king rose slowly, the weight of his ceremonial armor making the movement deliberate. He descended the steps, one by one, until he stood within striking distance. "You believe this ends with me?" Zorthal rumbled. Celine tightened her grip on her blade. Your family died screaming. You'll do the same. A flicker of something passed through the king's expression. Amusement, perhaps. Or resignation. Then, with the swiftness of a predator, he struck. Kai barely deflected the first blow, the sheer force of it sending him skidding back. Zorthal was no feeble ruler. He fought like a warlord, his strikes precise, his strength monstrous. His blade, jagged and cruel, cut through the air with terrifying speed. Celine darted in, seeking an opening, but the king was faster than any being his size should have been. He caught her wrist mid-strike, twisting hard enough to make bone crack. She wrenched free, pain lancing up her arm, but the moment's hesitation was all he needed. His fist slammed into her ribs, sending her sprawling. Kai moved to intercept, his knife slashing toward the king's throat, but Zorthal pivoted, bringing his blade up to parry. Steel met steel, sparks dancing in the dim light. Kai pressed forward, muscles burning with exertion, but the king absorbed the force, shoving him back with sheer brute strength. Celine, breath ragged, pushed herself to her feet. Blood dripped from her mouth, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She reached into her belt, fingers closing around the last resort. Zorthal saw the movement and turned toward her, ready to strike her down. Kai moved in that instant, exploiting the fraction of a second where the king's attention faltered. He ducked low, driving his poisoned blade into the gap beneath Zorthal's ribs. The king's body jerked, his breath hitching. He looked down at the weapon buried in his side, then at Kai, something unreadable in his gaze. You are relentless, Zorthal murmured. His knees buckled, his massive form sagging. Perhaps that is why your kind will survive. Kai twisted the blade. And why yours won't. The king collapsed, his final breath rattling in his chest. Silence settled over the chamber. The last of the Zalcor royal bloodline lay dead at their feet. Celine exhaled, wiping the blood from her mouth. It's done. Kai looked down at the body, then at the body scattered across the floor. Not yet. They moved quickly, setting charges along the pillars, the throne, the archways. The citadel was more than a palace, it was a symbol. And symbols, when shattered, carried more weight than any single death. As they stepped out into the night, the first explosions rippled through the structure. Fire consumed the throne room, the sound of crumbling stone and collapsing walls echoing through the city. By the time the Zalcor forces arrived, the assassins were gone. Only ruin remained.